Ryan White, you directed the short documentary Coded, which tells the story of gay illustrator J.C. Liondecker, who was able to communicate queerness in his illustrations and advertisements, even though he was working in the early 20th century. When did you become familiar with Liondecker and his work?
When I started making this film. So I mean, I think that's sort of the point of the film, is that so few people have heard of J.C. Liondecker, and I sort of shamefully am one of those people who had never heard of him. So I had made a documentary series in 2020 for Apple TV Plus called Visible, which is about the history of LGBTQ representation on television. So it's all about television history. So the first episode took place in the 40s and 50s with the advent of television. And our first storyline in that series was about the Army McCarthy hearings, which was the first time the word homosexual was ever said on television. And at the time that went out to, tens of millions of people because there were so few channels, and LGBTQ people were obviously demonized in the Army McCarthy hearings. But in the research of that storyline, we discovered this era that predated the Great Depression, during the Roaring Twenties, that many people many historians refer to as the pansy craze, which was this era of a pretty large burst of LGBTQ progress that even I, as a gay person, didn't know a lot about. I saw, I think, a season of Transparent where they went into that in Berlin a little bit, but that it was happening in a lot of the major metropolises worldwide, including New York. And that's where we discovered J.C. Liondecker, who was a prominent New Yorker, one of the most famous Americans in the 1920s, rumored to be the impetus for The Great Gatsby. And it kind of blew my mind that this man had been so famous, and that he had been creating artwork and ads that were all over American magazines and newspapers that were so seemingly gay and homoerotic in the 1920s. And we wanted to know more about him and why his story has been somewhat forgotten from history.
And how is it different? Really digging into this one subject versus, as you mentioned, Visible, which was such this broad survey of history.
Yeah, well, Visible was sort of an outlier in my filmmaking career. I mostly have made verite films, following some sort of event unfolding. And almost all my films, besides Visible, have been about a character or a group of characters. Like, that's why I love documentary filmmaking. I love holding my camera and just following the unpredictability of something. So I was much more comfortable kind of going back to my roots with the story of Liondecker because it was a character film. And even though the story was 100 years old, it felt like the verite process in a lot of ways, because it was a process of discovery through archival and unearthing his letters and diaries and whatever existed. So in that way, even though it could be looked at as sort of ancient history, it felt very alive in a way of going through that discovery and investigation process to find out his life story.
And in the process of telling this film, you incorporate animation into the film, which of course is fitting with Liondecker and his work and his style. How did that idea develop, and how did you want to work to incorporate that?
Well, I think the animation spawned from a couple different places. First, the visual record was so limited of Lionendecker's life. And if you watch the film, that was deliberately so. When Liondecker died, he had his lifelong partner burn most of the visual record from his life, most of his letters and diaries, and even a lot of his artwork, unfortunately. And so there weren't a ton of photos. There was no footage of Liondecker. So we had to figure out a way to constitute the film. And I think it's part of the reason it made a better short film than a feature film, was because the visual record was so limited. And the second reason for animation was, we did this film during COVID. We began the film in the summer of 2020. And all the verite films that I'd been making were shut down, understandably, because we couldn't be out in the field. And so to tell the Liondecker story, presented, at least for me as a filmmaker, a unique opportunity to flex a different muscle and to use a new skill set. And animation is very easy to do during a pandemic because it's all done within these amazing artists' offices. And this team of people sort of brought Lionendecker's artwork to life, and Lionendecker's personal story we animate sort of inspired by the brushstrokes of his very signature brushstrokes of his artwork. So it was safe, and it allowed us a way to tell a story from 100 years ago.
And helping to bring the story to life also was Neil Patrick Harris, who is featured in the film as the voice of Liondecker. He also participated in Invisible. Like, what was that decision like to bring him on board and to have him bring Lionendecker's words to life?
Yeah, he's like my go-to voiceover actor now. No, both times we've asked Neil to be in projects, I've been shocked when he said yes, honestly. More coded than visible, because it's a short film. I mean, as everyone I'm sure will talk about today, it's really difficult when you've made a short to grab the attention that you can with a feature or a series. And so I wasn't sure, Neil was our top choice. I think he was sort of the perfect person to play Liondecker. So he was the first person we went out with, but I was expecting to get a no, or even more likely to get no response at all. So when he responded so positively to it, I was thrilled, because I think it gets the film a little bit more visibility than it would have without someone of his stature. And he also brought, Neil's a brilliant actor, and I realized this in Visible, even though he was doing narration work in Visible. There's a real genius when it comes to voiceover acting, and especially, I would consider coded more acting than narration. He's playing Liondecker, and so he brought an emotional depth to Liondecker that far exceeded my expectations. So we were thrilled when he said yes, and when we recorded it with him, it just made the film even better.
As you mentioned, in the film, Liondecker had much of his materials destroyed after his death, and it sort of makes me reflect on how much homophobia has, cost us in just history. Like, right. All of these documents that we don't have, that we maybe would have if there had been more openness throughout history. What do you think about that sort of like excavating of like things that we continue to learn about historical figures, and gay history was much more prominent than we usually think of it?
Yeah, I think we often think that gay history began with Stonewall, and we ran into this in Visible as well, and understanding that it far, as important as Stonewall was, and it is a huge turning point for us as a community, but there was a lot of history before that. And like you said, unfortunately, a lot of that has been lost, whether that was deliberately or not, or will never be known. One of my favorite parts of having made Coded is hearing from people about the older generations in their family. And, even though Liondecker is probably one of the most famous queer people from his era, even his story was lost. So you can imagine non-famous people. So we've been hearing from a lot of, especially people of older generations, who their older generations might have been gay and hid it for whatever reason, so you'll hear stories like, oh, my aunt was like that. She had a lifelong roommate, and no one, in the 1910s through the 1950s, and no one ever talked about it. But now when I look back, that was her wife. And so I think that's a really fun part of getting to be a documentary filmmaker from a marginalized community. Is I know that's been my education in queer history a lot, is watching documentaries, because it wasn't taught to me in school growing up. And so getting to tell those stories, it's not, I don't exclusively make queer stories, but a lot of my filmography feels like, getting to add to that history where we as a community get to tell our own stories, and our community gets to watch these stories that may have been forgotten for whatever reason.
Well, I want to congratulate you on your work on this film. Congratulations on being shortlisted for the Oscar. And we will have you back soon for the group session.
Thank you, Daniel. Take care.
Christine Turner, you directed the documentary short Lynching Postcards, which recounts how postcards were used as proud mementos of just the horrific terrorism against African Americans during the Jim Crow era. How did you make the decision to explore and document this particularly disturbing aspect of American history?
Yeah, I was really drawn to this subject matter at this time because of our contemporary moment and because of the killings, the murders of people like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and some of the what some people describe as modern day lynchings that have been documented and that we have all been witnessing and have been filmed on video. And I really thought back to these postcards, which anti-lynching activists, such as the NAACP and others, had really used as evidence in their fight against lynching, and how they, as activists, took these postcards and subverted their original intent. These, as you mentioned, these were celebrations of white supremacy, and used them to indict that very white supremacy. So I was thinking a lot about the parallels to today. But of course, lynching is a subject matter that I think to some degree all of us have learned a little bit about in history. But this particular angle, these postcards are not something that I think a lot of people have been made aware of. Certainly I didn't learn about it in school, but I did come across them in research, actually for other histories that were, other documentaries looking at Black history, and just felt that they had been really underexplored, at least in documentary film, and that this could provide a new angle and a new understanding of our lynching history.
Yeah, I also, of course, thought about Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd in this, and in both the ways that just seeing this violence, just carrying on through the century, but also how the fact that at least in the modern day, these images have been at least used to get justice in a couple of isolated situations, which is a little progress, but obviously not enough. Progress would be these things not happening in the first place.
Right.
So what do you think about that kind of the way that has changed, the way that imagery and the way we receive it has changed?
Yeah, it's like we're in an interesting moment, because I think that there, at this, it's like, how much more of this imagery, do we need, in a sense, in order to make the point that this is happening? But it seems like without that documentation, the conversation would be lost. And in the film, we explore how anti-lynching activists are able to use these postcards and use that photography and turn it around, and just in the way that we're starting to see that happen right now in this moment. And as you said, progress, of course, would be that we're not experiencing these killings, but I think it's necessary, in order to help put an end to it anyway, to expose it and to make the public aware of it.
And of course, to make a film about this subject, you're must be going through this incredibly upsetting imagery. Like how long was that process, and how what was that difficult to kind of decompress from that sort of thing as you're inundated with this history?
Yes, yeah, it was very difficult to really sort of sift through all of these images and try and process them and sit with them, and in particular in the editing process, constantly revisiting them. And I struggled with it. I struggled with, how much do we show, and what do we show, and at what moment are we showing it, and why are we showing it? And thought a lot about the presentation of that imagery and where to focus the viewer's eye, and what were the points, how was I advancing the story with each of these images. And in that process, what I realized is that sort of ongoing struggle of how, what to show and what not to show was actually the same struggle that anti-lynching activists were we're also dealing with and figuring out how to use that imagery most effectively, and how to, you know, really indict the country and shame the country. And so it was difficult, very much.
And then the subtitle of the film, "Token of a Great Day," which is taken from one of those postcards, is just such a, you know, just the concise underlining of how kind of horrific the idea of celebrating these images was at the time. Tell me about like what stood out about that particular line from a postcard to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks so much to just the mentality, the idea that, you know, these lynchings were, you know, they were public spectacles. Thousands of people would sometimes attend these events. They had a carnival-like atmosphere. You would have men, women, and children from, you know, varying social classes all participating, and how, in some ways, how normalized these events were, so much so that, you know, it was just evidence of a good time. And so that token of a great day really jumped out at me, and really speaks to how so many white citizens and participants viewed these really horrific events.
Yeah, and also, you know, it's just striking how, you know, in the grand scheme of things, this history is not that old. Like, this is a generation whose grandchildren are probably alive right now, if not children. You know, it's just so hard to kind of put yourself in the mindset of people who would celebrate that kind of violence. Was that difficult for you as well, just to kind of see these images and see that just kind of how casual it seemed?
Yeah, very difficult. But, you know, I felt that it was just necessary to confront that imagery. I think it's necessary as a country for us to really confront this kind of history, and necessary in order for us to move forward. And of course, you know, we take a couple steps forward and a couple steps back. But I think that you know, this certainly serves as a reminder of this not very distant history, and just how deeply rooted, you know, the issues that we're seeing today, and you know, where they emanate, where they come from. You know, in some ways, lynching really becomes prevalent at a moment, you know, in American history after the Civil War, and we're experiencing, you know, Blacks are gaining rights, and they're making economic progress, and they're participating in the political process, and there is a very strong white backlash, you know, not unsimilar to what we are seeing here today. And so I think that those are, you know, those parallels are there. And although the film is historical and we're looking at, you know, a moment and moments in history, I really do feel it speaks indirectly to what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, it does seem like, you know, sometimes two steps forward, two steps back sometimes, as we are learning about how much of history has been kind of, you know, buried a little bit, you know, whether it's these postcards or the Tulsa Massacre, which we've seen in media in recent years, in Watchmen and in Lovecraft Country. And now also we've got the response to that, which is the idea of whether children should be taught anything about racism in schools. Do you feel like things are, you know, moving more forward than back? Like, are we inching forward, or are you worried about, you know, just how much of a backlash we're going to have?
I mean, I think it's what you just said before. There's progress, and then of course there's some steps back overall. I think we can certainly say today, you know, the kinds of the type of lynching that was occurring in the past is not what we're experiencing today, and that's due in large part because of the actually African American, you know, men and women who fought against these practices. And so much of the story of the film Lynching Postcards is actually a story about Black resistance and about Black agency, and about how people really fought back against lynching, and they used these postcards in order to do so. And you mentioned the Tulsa Massacre, and of course there were postcards, you know, made of that horrific event as well. And of course, those postcards were then turned around and used to indict that event. So I think that, yes, undoubtedly we have seen tremendous progress, but I think that there's still a lot of work to do.
Congratulations on your film. Congratulations on being shortlisted for an Academy Award for the film. And it's been a pleasure talking with you. We'll have you back for the group discussion at the end.
Thank you.
Reza Riahi, you directed the animated short The Musician, which tells the story of two lovers separated for decades by the Mongol invasion and occupation of Persia in the 13th century. What made you want to tell a story set during this particular period of history?
When I started to do the first draft, I was listening to this instrument called kamanche. That's the instrument that actually the musician plays in the film. And when I was listening to this very particular instrument, I was really drawn by the part of mysterious and mystical part of this instrument. And I started to do the first draft. And the other part was I studied, before I finished my study in animation, I first studied in painting in Tehran, in Iran. And back then I was really drawn into all the Persian miniatures and all the history about the lovers and kings and everything about them. And I was very drawn by this very classical way, but also the same pattern that was repeating itself in nowadays countries by the government, and all how these decisions impact the individuals' lives. So I started to write this film, this story, and knowing that the Mongolian attack has a huge impact in this region, not just Persia, I mean the whole region, and still resonated today. So it was this kind of the pattern that I was going to create, but I know that it's something that actually it talks for today's, as we saw like recently, the Taliban and all the stuff that is going back and forth, and the people of the Middle East are paying for it. And also the fact that I was very struck by this story of the resilience of the people of this region, that they keep having hope and going forward. As I consider myself one of them, because I moved to France after 20 years growing up in Iran, and it's kind of the story of the resilience that we still try to do something about it. Like we still paint, do music, do film, tell our stories, even though the situation is not the same as
And how did you develop the different styles visually in the film? Because you have the scenes in the palace that are in color, and you have a slightly different style in the flashback scenes of the invasion. How did you develop those different looks?
Well, the main one, the colored one, very based on the Persian miniature, was my main influence. And so I studied this, but I started to really dig into all the looks and all the very old paintings, and to be able to talk about the kind of the flashbacks of these two people, of lovers. So I was inspired by the Chinese puppets show that is very dark and very silhouette, and the lights is very different. And to be able to have some part of very blurry memories of the past that is not so clear, but we can see the very efficient stuff. And so I from the beginning, I know that there's two techniques, but it was obvious choice, but it wasn't obvious to do because I never done this technique, paper cutout. So I started to do all the research from everything started with the paper. I went to the store, art store, and I bought so many papers for months and tried everything to make sure that's what's going to happen. Then the animator is going to play around, it's a stop motion, so everything's happening in front of the camera. And so it took me months to be able to achieve to this final render. and I know from the beginning it's going to be two different style, but it wasn't obvious. It wasn't obvious in the beginning to achieve this. Yeah.
This story, you tell it without spoken dialogue. So there's so much of the, the illustration and the just the imagery has to communicate so much even more. What was it like trying to achieve that kind of eloquence just in the images without dialogue?
Yeah, that was a first challenge when I started to do the storyboard. But I loved it very much because I loved this challenge because I really wanted to aim to every culture that can see this film without any dialogue, without any language, without any translation or subtitle. They can understand some the emotions of the film. And also, I know that, I chose the music. So the music is the language of its international music language. So I was aiming for this, and I had a chance to work with a very great musician, Sabo Alizadeh. That's he's one of the greatest heritage of the Persian music, and the only voice of the film is actually his score. So he was the actual actor, the invisible actor of the film. So I was really depending on the sound, on the music of the Sabo's instrument.
One of the most striking sequences in the film, you're intercutting the invasion with scenes of celebration and going back and forth between them. Was that challenging to craft, or what was what inspired that?
That was a core part when I started to write the film. I know I really wanted to have this feeling of the back and forth. I did that in not either film, and in my future film, I'm trying to put this setting. And the challenging part was that when I do the animatic, the storyboard, we had to do the animation, the music in the same time, like the finished music, because the animators, they have to animate on the music, and everything should be match precisely to the image. So that was a huge challenge, actually, as you mentioned, because the musician, he was working in Tehran, in Iran, and we were based in France, in Paris, and I was going back and forth with the visuals, animatic, and the musician and the producers to be able to have this quality of the music that matches the images. And we fortunately had very good help in the storyboard with a friend of mine, and we had so many meetings, and we finally we were able to finish this part.
And the faces on your characters, the expressions are very expressive and communicate so much as well. Tell me about designing those characters and making them come to life.
Well, it wasn't so obvious because of the cutouts. Technique doesn't give you that much of this this opportunity of to communicate through the emotion of the faces, or all the eyes and movements. So I came up with the technique of having the kind of plastic paper that I treated, and I put in every puppets. I have to say, there's over 200 puppets and so many details of the film to make them the store and all the animated. It took a while, and so we came up with this. I came up with this technique that's animators, they were drawing at the same time on the paper, on the plastic, and that at the same time they were moving the character in front of the camera. So it was like a double task for the animators. It's something, stop motion is always challenging. But like for this one, we had to have this emotion, this communication. We didn't have any dialogue. So there was music, whether the gestures, and also this communication between these three characters from the past and the future, the present. So we need to have this. So it came up with this technique.
What inspired you, just to tell stories through animation in the first place, and to get into animation?
Well, I started to, I was a caricaturist from the beginning, and I was cartoonist. And then I started to study painting. miniature and classical painting. And after that, little by little, I started to write the stories. And one of my friends told me that you have to do comic strip because, you tell the story and you drawing good images. So I started to do that, and I studied in France, one of the greatest schools in France. And after that, I really needed the rhythm and the music and the dialogue. And very automatically, naturally, I come to animation. The solution was animation. So I write my stories and I draw them myself. And so that's that's it.
Well, congratulations on The Musician. Congratulations on being shortlisted for the Oscar for Best Animated Short. And it's been a pleasure talking with you about it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Mikey Please, you, along with Dan Ojari, directed the animated short Robin, which is about a robin who is raised by mice and wants to prove that she can be a good mouse to fit in with her family. Where did the inspiration for this story come from?
Ooh, we found a small mouse being raised by a family of robins, and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting? No, that's not true. No, so Dan and I shared a studio after we graduated, initially just to sort of share equipment. Actually, we were both stop motion animators, but then we found actually the sort of more interesting thing we were sharing were our kind of little kernels of ideas. And the story for Robin, I think it came about relatively quickly in one evening after we'd sort of finished our main work for the day, and we started talking about this story of a robin being raised by a family of mice, and where that actually came from, we're not too sure. Dan thinks that maybe it was his wife mentioned, wouldn't it be nice to do a story about a robin? But basically the situation we found so interesting and fun, and immediately it led to all these different sort of avenues that it really stuck with us. So this fairly quick premise that came about in an evening then stuck with us for about 5 years, and we'd be constantly telling this story to like our family and friends, and particularly like around winter time. And so it became this sort of oral tradition story that we would kind of pin people to the wall and try and hold their attention all the way to the end of this story. And so after that quite long time of just telling people this story in a verbal way, we thought, oh, maybe it's good enough to try and actually do something else with it. So we then put together this little picture book where we'd sort of roughly illustrated just as a way to convey the story. And we worked with one of our favorite illustrators, Brian E. May Smith, to pull together some kind of world images, and then took it to try and pitch to people. But yeah, the story itself, we really couldn't say where it came from. It was just a conversational delight that turned up one evening.
What was it like designing, designing the characters, creating the puppets, materials you'd use, color, size, shape, like, the personality of it? Like, how involved was that process?
Wow, yeah, that's I suppose the overall visual aesthetic of the production evolved over a long period. So obviously Dan and I are both stop motion animators, so we have a style in our other work which has developed over the years of collaborating on lots of various projects. And I think one of the sort of distinctive things maybe about our particular kind of stop motion is that it's always got this very illustrative foundation. So we really like to build compositions to camera, so to work with very kind of bold graphic compositions rather than say like building a sort of 3D world like a doll's house set and moving the camera around it. We like to start from an illustration. So with Robin, we brought in another hero of ours, an illustrator and painter called Matthew Forsyth, who was our production designer. So he was a big part of forming that kind of overall visual look. And one of the things that we really loved about his work, as well as it sort of feeling like a very classical painting, but with a quite contemporary design approach, one of the things that we loved was this really deep approach to color. So there was lots of hues overlaying each other, where a little bit like a sort of Lucian Freud painting, where a green might give the impression of a green, but actually when you look into it, there's blues and reds and pinks and all these things working together. And that felt very thematically resonant with what we wanted to say with the film as well, which is about how different things, when they come together, can form something richer. So that was nice to find that visual expression of that idea. It was quite a deep question. There's loads of it. So the materials, we used needle felt wool for the characters, but actually the world is a whole spectrum of materials and approaches. There's lots of carved wood and other textiles at work, but the fact that the needle felt characters were always kind of right in the center of the screen, and it's a really tactile material that it's really hard to do in any other way. That's why we liked it as well. It's like, it's definitely stop motion. There's no other material or way of reproducing that. But the fact that we had that very tactile thing front and center meant that we could kind of go to town on the cinematicness of the rest of the image. So we kept that, the characters very grounded, and were able to make the world feel quite sort of epic and atmospheric and cinematic.
And another part of bringing this story to life involved you and your co-director sort of acting out scenes to create kind of visual references for the film. Like, how long is that process? And do you ever get self-conscious, in these moments where you're, becoming a robin, becoming a magpie? Yeah,
it is extremely embarrassing to do, and certainly to see some of those clips kind of creep out into the world. But it's an extremely helpful part of the production. Anyone who's worked animation knows that it's a process of tiny steps, and they can often be quite arduous and slow. And so to have that little window of the day where you can be very loud and expressive and spontaneous and become those characters was a great part of the day. But we had to do it alone. we're not the kind of actors who can stand up in front of the whole crew and be like, this is it. So making those live action references were extremely helpful as well, especially during the pandemic, which is obviously when we were shooting, which is obviously stop motion. There's all different kind of ways of doing it, but our particular production was maybe more like a live action shoot, in that we couldn't all do it remotely. We all had to be in one place, one building, but we weren't allowed to spend a lot of time with each other. So these live action references were a brilliant way to kind of communicate to our actors, who are the animators, exactly what we were trying to get across.
And stop motion animation in general is, just such a painstaking process, with how much work and attention to detail goes into just every single second of footage. Where do you develop that, patience to, have this story envisioned and watch it be created basically a frame at a time?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. People often attribute sort of stop motion to patience, but the funny thing is, I think we're actually all incredibly impatient. We're always wanting to kind of push forward to the next step. But I think it's I suppose a process of being able to kind of compartmentalize a process and be quite regimented and organized. So I think it's a case of organization more than patience. You do have to kind of break down what you're doing into 1,000 little steps, but actually once those little steps are broken down, you can be quite impatient about how you get through them. Does that make sense? Probably not.
And you've also assembled an impressive cast. Bronte Carmichael as Robin, also Richard E. Grant as Magpie, Gillian Anderson as Cat. Like, what was it like assembling that cast? Did you have actors in mind at the outset? What went into that?
Yeah, it was extraordinary how that cast came together, and they all kind of came on board within a space of 2 weeks. So there were these really exciting moments where we're like, we've got Bronte and we've got Richard. But Richard E. Grant was certainly someone who we had very centrally as our Magpie character. We had lots of pictures of him in With Nail and I and various other productions on our kind of character design pinboard. Not so much for the character himself of With Nail, because Magpie is actually he has that slight sort of misanthropic edge, but actually he's a much warmer character in his heart. But there's something about the humor of being able to kind of take the mick out of someone who's from a very high status, which is the Richard E. Grant character. So being able to kind of undercut his view of the world, which is a very materialistic, shallow approach, and make fun of it was perfect. And as soon as we put Richard E. Grant in that role, even as we were doing the development, it clicked and it worked. So to actually get the real Richard E. Grant to come and do the voice was a huge thrill. And working with them in the recording, we got some real recording time with them, and then a lot of it was done remotely. But those first few sessions where we were all in the room together and kind of workshopping the characters were just extraordinary. Like I remember looking over to Dan, and as Richard was singing his Magpie song, and just sort of flashing through the 6 years of having kind of wrote that song in our studio in our quite sort of humble settings, then eventually all those steps to get to sit in the room with Richard and have him sing your song for you is amazing.
Well, congratulations on the film, and you're on the Oscar shortlist for Best Animated Short for it. So congratulations about that. It's been a pleasure talking with you about it.
Thank you, Daniel.
Alexandria Jackson, you directed the documentary short Sophie and the Baron about your cousin, Sophie Kipner, an artist who wanted to reinterpret the classic Rolling Stone photos taken by Baron Woolman. What made you decide to pick up the camera and commit all this to film?
Well, it was very organic at first. Sophie wanted me, I have a background in photojournalism, and Sophie wanted me to meet Baron, who had shot some of the most iconic music photography, of Woodstock era and Jimi Hendrix's guitar, and both of us were huge fans. So I came in to meet them, and I fell in love with their dynamic. The two of them were so charming and wonderful together that I just started filming as she started to reinterpret the first piece. And then quickly saw a really beautiful story in their friendship and in the mentorship that Baron was offering, not just Sophie, but ultimately me as well. So we kept shooting, and then I was like a little pest, and every time, followed them to Santa Fe and encouraged them to get together over the 3 years, and I kept shooting.
And the film is really, showcases the collaboration of art, because we've got, the photography of Baron, you've got Sophie's visual art, bringing in the third art form, which is your filmmaking. What was it like to have to think about all of these kind of forms collide into one sort of united piece?
Well, yeah, that was just so fun. I think there's something so important about artists validating other artists and kind of the confidence that can give you. And but for Baron to open up his prolific photographs of some of these, to Sophie, a newer artist, he had seen her work and really liked what she was doing, but she was brave enough to ask. And actually Sophie met Baron really fortuitously in a bar while bartending in London. And they got to talking, and after he left, she looked him up and realized that she had been collecting his images for years, wanting to reinterpret them, and had just met him. So they kind of were pen pals for a while. And then she ended up got brave enough when back in the States, and asked him if she could do it. And he said yes. He which is something really beautiful about Baron, is that he just encourages you to say yes, jump in, and because you can always say no later, but just do it. And so she interpreted his art, and then they let me come in, who knows why, but we just had a really fun time. And so I was then filming them. And I think for Baron, it ended up being, he was so comfortable with his own work and his own legacy that he was happy to let, this happen. And he didn't really see anything I'd done other than some, that he knew I could shoot photos. But, and so there was a lot of trust there. And yeah, their friendship was different mediums, different ages, different eras. And it all works because I think that art can really unify us in beautiful ways. And, beyond sort of the art that they made together, their friendship was really wonderful too. So.
Yeah, and there are a lot of stories about tortured artists, but this one really feels like it's you're striving to capture the joy in creating art. Is that part of what you wanted to really showcase here about this relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just felt great being around them. So I couldn't, and they're just such wonderful people to watch, and the way that they interact. And, we filmed over a period of 3 years, and 6 months before we finished shooting, Baron found out that he had ALS, and it was a very rapid decline. And I was the last person, other than a few very close people to him, to see him in March 2020 before the world shut down, to kind of pick up some footage in Santa Fe. And so what had begun for him as this, him being open to mentoring and to opening his world, really, I think, became something that he couldn't have even imagined, in that it gave him this, so he lost his ability to speak about a month after I left in March, but he was very much himself. ALS is one of the most brutal diseases I've ever seen firsthand. And, but he was so himself. So he, while locked off from the rest of the world, was really involved in editing this film, and really loved the movie and loved Sophie, and literally every day we were speaking, and I was sending him cuts, and he was giving me shit for misspelling Jimi Hendrix. And I mean, he was a really fun, lovely person with great life advice, and just wonderful to sort of interact with. And I think that he could have never known that by saying yes and jumping in with Sophie, that he then would have this really beautiful thing to focus on, which he called the film the bookend to his life as a photographer and friend. So he was able to focus on that, and through the pandemic, which was kind of a gift to all of us.
And of course, him having passed away, now having this film as a sort of celebration of him, and as a document of just his artistry, like, you couldn't have kind of imagined what the significance of that would have been when you started.
No, none of us could have imagined any of this, to be honest. And I think that's sort of what's so beautiful about Baron's legacy. It's not just his incredible work some of the most iconic photos of our time, really, but his philosophy in life, which was to just say yes, and to seize the moment, and to follow your bliss, and to collaborate, and to validate each other in a way that I feel sometimes can be missing in, film is very collaborative, but there are a lot of different art forms sometimes you're in your own bubble, and that's fine and great. But how cool if you've reached that level to be happy to mentor, and to be open to mentoring younger, and letting, younger filmmakers, younger artists work with you. And I think for us in this film, it was kind of a family affair. Our producers, Courtney Cox and Joanna Natazagara, gave me my first jobs in film, and were incredibly involved in this. Not many people know that Courtney Cox is really into documentaries. And so she's like a brilliant in the edit room. And then I made, my editor was my friend from film school, our composers, all of our dear friends, even people that he had shot wanted to be, like Mick Jagger gave us a song, We Have Sympathy for the Devil, in the film. And that typically doesn't happen with the short film, but it's really a testament to Baron, who had shot, of course, some of Jagger's most famous shots, like the one behind me with him in the top hat and stuff. So there was just a lot of goodwill, and yeah, on a lot of different levels of people being involved because it made you feel good, and that warmth kind of, I think, we all felt in different ways, everyone who worked on it.
What stands out to you about Woolman's photography and his body of work, and what do you think it was that Sophie was able to kind of draw out in it in using her different art form?
Yeah, it's fun to hear Sophie talk about it, because she talks about how his art has a lot of juju. She says, like, something about, he didn't just shoot these celebrities, he shot crowds. And the sort of central piece in the film is actually not a shot of anyone knows, but a shot of the crowd at Woodstock and people experiencing Woodstock, and so the way she works is, she blind contours first, her initial, which is an art school technique that she kind of used as the premise for her technique, but she doesn't look at the subject. She looks, she only looks at the subject and not at the page. So she's really which is kind of a way for her, she feels, not to judge her art. She started it in London to get out of her head, because oftentimes, for instance, like, artists don't love necessarily playing Pictionary because they're supposed to be good, or an amazing singer might not love doing karaoke because you're supposed to be amazing. This was a way to kind of even the playing field and just get out of your head, and it's something so that she used to access these things. So to your point, that he has so much emotion and cool juju, she says, in his work, that when she does the blind contour, she's just looking at his picture and not the page, and just sort of does the initial blind contour. Then of course her artistry comes in when she shades it in and brings it to life and paints it. She looks while doing that, but the initial thing is really just motivated by what she's seeing. And there's a lot of parallels. It's much like how a photojournalist shoots without necessarily consciously composing a shot. They're taking a picture, not making a picture. And that's how Barron described, and he talks about it in the film, he's not hearing the music around him. He's really just in a trance, capturing it. And that's, and to add what you were saying before, another layer, it's how kind of I've shot the two of them. It wasn't overly set up, I wasn't moving lights around. I was really moving with them. And it was a kind of a very organic, the way the three of us work was quite organic, even though in different mediums,
Well, one thing this movie made me want to do is try blind contouring, even as someone who has absolutely no artistic experience myself. It is a kind of an inspiring, way to inspire art, this film. And so I want to thank you for it. Congratulations on it, and congratulations on being shortlisted for the Oscar. And it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
I'm Gold Derby editor Daniel Montgomery, here with the filmmakers behind some of this year's short films that have been shortlisted for the Oscars. Mikey Please from Robin Robin and Reza Riahi from The Musician are in the running for Best Animated Short. We've got Ryan White from Coded, Christine Turner from Lynching Postcards, and Alexandria Jackson from Sophie and the Baron, who are contenders for Best Documentary Short. So first off, what did the recognition mean to you to be, singled out in this way from so many other films that were considered? And what would the nomination or even the win mean to you? Let's start with Alexandria.
Oh, well, I mean, we were completely blown away. This is nothing we could have ever imagined or dreamed of when we started shooting this thing. And it's Disney picked us up as the first original documentary, which is mind-blowing to us. And it's just been wonderful. We have such a wonderful team, and it's a big family on our crew. And I think that for us, it's really extra special being able to celebrate Baron Woolman, the two subjects passed away. And I just feel like he's very much orchestrating all of this magic from upstairs. But yeah, we're very honored and shocked, really.
Yeah, and how about you, Christine?
Yeah, similar to Alexandra, it was, this is not something that I could have imagined when I set out to make the film. And it's an incredible honor to be amongst this group and the other films that are nominated. I think, it's exciting because it'll raise visibility for this history that I think has been lost. And so hopefully more people will become familiar with this story, and hopefully that we can all confront the issues that it brings up. So I'm happy for that reason alone.
Reza?
Yeah, as a filmmaker, none of us actually, we were doing the film, we were thinking about these moments, of course, but we were all trying to do something good to be proud of. But it's, yeah, we were blown away with my producer, and we were like very, very proud. And yeah, I don't know what to add to this.
How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I agree with everyone. I think it's very surprising, and it's also very humbling. You know, I think for the doc specifically, it's doc filmmakers that select the shortlist. So a huge honor, I think. You know, I've seen Christine's film many times. I love the idea of like she said, visibility. That getting on the shortlist, because it's hard to get a short film watched by a lot of people, but the shortlist is definitely a huge step in viewership. So stories like hers, which are so important, and the story of Liondecker, which I think has been lost to history in some ways. If people rediscover him because it made the shortlist, then I'm thrilled.
Mikey?
Yeah, so as everyone's said, it's an amazing surprise and honor. I think everyone agree that, you know, when you start out making these projects, you have all these ingredients and you're putting them together hoping that something's going to cohesify and it'll turn out, but often it is out of your hands. You know, you've got your material and you can do the best you can. So to know that it's sort of something about it must have worked in order for it to have come to this stage is really exciting, and especially for our crew. You know, it was an extremely awkward and stressful 9 months during the pandemic making it. So yeah, to be at this stage now where it feels like, okay, there's some element of it was worth all that awkwardness.
Yeah, and Ryan, as you were saying, there's you know, it can be hard to get you know, short films seen by a wider audience, but it does, like, I wonder if there is like this increasing visibility, public appreciation market for it now that we have services like Netflix, like Paramount Plus, like Disney Plus, that aren't beholden to a certain particular running time of material. Like, are you finding there are more opportunities for things to be seen, Ryan?
Oh, for sure. Like I'm thrilled that companies like Disney are picking up films like Alexandria's. You know, I think shorts have for some time have been the redheaded stepchild, and don't deserve to be. And I think audiences have proved that over the last 5 years, especially with documentaries, that they're willing to tune in for nonfiction content in a million different forms. You know, I think the series format was a huge surprise to everyone in the last decade, that people would tune into nonfiction in the way that they do a scripted series. And so, yeah, my hope is that the streamers especially continue to stay in the business of short films and continue to get them added visibility.
Yeah, Alexandria?
Oh, I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've seen every one of these films on this panel and loved them all so much. And, you know, it was amazing being able to watch them right now. Unfortunately, ours, Sophie and the Baron isn't out for a couple months on Disney Plus, but I loved being able to watch them. And I think it's incredibly important.
Reza?
Yeah, that actually the short film, that's the thing. Sometimes as an animation filmmaker, people think that you do the short film, you're going to do the feature, but the thing is, like, the format of the short film is a format that so many animation filmmakers they like, as myself, like, is part of the storytelling that we like to make it like a short, and that's very huge. That we can have our films in the shortlisted, and people can see the films is visible for them, and to make sure that people know that it's just a format of the short film, and the future is nothing. It's nothing big and small, and just some short filmmakers, they like to have their stories to be in this format. Yeah.
How about you, Mikey?
Yeah, I mean, it is really encouraging seeing particularly more streamers create these sort of anthology films, anthology collections, like on Netflix. There's like the Love, Death and Robots and The House, which is coming out tomorrow, I think. But absolutely, you know, as someone who's made a bunch of shorts and has gone to countless film festivals and watched these diamonds of storytelling emerge, it can sometimes be frustrating to think like, there isn't that platform culturally where they can be as appreciated and celebrated as I think they should be. But so hopefully, you know, the steps made by these streamers and platforms is really encouraging. But I think it would be great to see curated, sort of celebrated anthologies of films that have emerged through kind of that festival route, so which have been pushed by independent filmmakers such as you guys here. That would be a really wonderful thing to see more of.
How about you, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone has said, and I love making short form films. I love making short films. They're an interesting challenge, and I'm always trying to figure out how much can you say in the least amount of time, which is an interesting challenge. But I think, not every film needs to be a feature film anyway. Sometimes, the short form is right for the subject. And so I think, it gives an opportunity, I think, for more filmmakers to create work and have their work be seen and get out there. And certainly helps to diversify the content. And I think the barriers to entry are also lower. So we're hearing more voices from more different people. And I think that's really exciting too.
Yeah, short film definitely isn't sort of just like a precursor to feature length, or, it's very much like a short story isn't less valuable because there are also novels. So what do you think are some of the benefits of telling a story in a shorter format, Christine?
Well, I think that in a way, because it's shorter, many more people might be able to see it. It's probably easier to find, 15 minutes, for example, in one's day-to-day routine than it might be 2 hours. So I think the short length in that sense might mean that more people could potentially see a film. And you could watch 4 of those short films as opposed to one feature-length film, for example. And I love feature-length films, but I also think that, the short form also offers the opportunity to have experiment, right? We're seeing many different styles and styles and approaches to the short documentary. And so I think you just get a taste of more things.
Reza?
Yeah, the short films offer, as you said, when you go to the seance of 4 or 5 short films, there's so many doors that opens to you, and you have so many stories than you like. It's kind of more richer to me actually than a feature. Even though I like the feature, I mean, there's a challenge of just doing a short film that you have a very the minutes, every minute counts, every second counts to develop the character, to bring the emotion that you want, than the feature or the TV series, of course. But I think the short film deserves to be more seen in the cinema and as a sense of the so many short films together, not just a feature. And the people have to, and it's also it takes less time to produce, and you can have so many other independent movie makers or filmmakers to make short films, rather than having the extreme budgets to have the features.
Ryan, you've worked in basically every length of film. What do you find are some of the benefits of short film?
Yeah, Coded is actually my first short film since my college days. So I loved getting to do that. It felt like returning to my roots in that way, and kind of going completely old school in the sense, like Reza said, the budgets aren't near as high. They can't be for many reasons. And as Christine said, the barrier to entry is a little bit lower. It democratizes filmmaking a little bit more when you don't have those barriers. And so I think it allows you to tell stories that maybe would never get the green light as a feature-length story, or definitely as a series. So in that way, it was really fun and a fun challenge. You know, you have to use your money very wisely on a short film because there's nothing can go to waste. And so I think that leads to better content in a lot of ways. Like someone said, every minute matters, every second matters in a short film.
Mikey?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that last point, that the kind of the confines of a short film are actually fantastic tools to kind of make you work harder, to make your ideas clearer. And yeah, when there is no room to kind of play or for the fact, you have to make sure that absolutely every little frame you're using is put to its best use, and that your thing that you're trying to say is simple and clear. And often with a limitless, not that I've ever been in that position of having a limitless resource and limitless time to play with, I'd imagine you've got more room for indulgence, and that lack of room for indulgence, I think, is a really strong creative ingredient in producing something good.
Alexandria?
Well, I think, you know, Christine was saying it really beautifully. I think often the content and the story dictates the length and how much time you really need to say what you need to say or what should be said. And I think, you know, with Lynching Postcards, it was incredibly powerful and moving and disturbing. And I think that any longer might have been too much for me, at least, you know, as an audience who really appreciated the incredible filmmaking. I just have to say, Mikey, I'm really obsessed with the magpie, total aside, but I love him. But yeah, I just think that for mine, it's different. I shot it over 3 years. It could have been any length. That's what it should have been. We cut it together, and, you know, we weren't doing a normal, you know, biopic or something. It was very much relationship based, talking about their friendship and collaboration. So that's what it ended up being. Luckily we had that, you know, we didn't have a studio at that point or anyone. It was just Lauren and I, and, you know, the producers like circling or giving some great advice. So we just determined it in the cutting room. But yeah, I think that sometimes people try to make things too long or too short or whatever. So it's good to see what the story needs.
Thank you all for talking to me about your very, very different, but all very impactful films in their own ways. And congratulations on your being shortlisted at the Oscars. Thank you so much for talking with me. It's been a pleasure.